Hi, welcome to the Military Wallet Podcast. I'm joined today with Jennifer Barnhill. Jennifer is a Bush Institute veteran leadership scholar, a freelance journalist, and a researcher, and she is the author of Military Stories You've Been Told and the Ones You Need to Hear. Jennifer, welcome to the show. I'm excited to talk to you about your book.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to chat with you.
So, I've read your book. To me, it was very eye opening. I am a military veteran. I was on active duty, enlisted, single member, junior enlisted, got out, came back in, joined the Guard. In between there, I was actually a military spouse for a while while my wife was in. Now I'm in the Guard. So, I'm not active duty. It's a little different than what you see on active duty. What really opened my eyes was how things are different for military spouses than what the narrative you hear, I guess, or what you see, especially in the junior ranks. So I'd love to hear what inspired you to write this book. And let's talk about that narrative. What is the story of military spouses, the story you hear, and what is the story that needs to be told?
Well, there's so many different things that inspired this book. Going back to maybe one of the first days I was a military spouse myself, I met my husband when I was working at the Smithsonian, and my background actually is in journalism and art history. And at that time, I had a scholarship lined up to get my PhD. It was paid for, and just like anyone in this community, whether they're on the service member side or the spouse side, our best laid plans, right? So my best laid plans kind of were put on hold for a little while after I fell in love and married my husband, who's currently active duty Navy. So it's very personal, this book. It's, my story, the things that I have experienced personally. But then over the years, I started picking up on the stories of the people around me. I wasn't alone. My experience with unemployment, gaps in my resume, struggles accessing benefits, none of these struggles were mine alone. And so I turned to my journalism background and I started reporting on a lot of these things for various outlets. And so that's how the conversation started. And then over the years, I learned a little bit more about the community. I got my master's degree in public administration, so I could even further dig in to find out what should be happening behind the scenes. And the book kind of came about because it doesn't all fit sometimes in those couple thousand word articles, right? So there's always more to the story. The book allowed me to kind of dig a little deeper into the stories that were told about our community. But we all know if you're part of the community at any level, there's the official policy and then there's the workaround or the real lived experience. And so this book is kind of a love letter to military spouses who have shared their stories with me over the years and just kind of peeling back some of the layers of the things that we don't really get as much of an insight into in this community, which is the experiences of families.
Yeah. So thank you for sharing your story, first of all, also for writing the book. As I said, it was eye opening for me. I was a military spouse. I got out of the military, got married to my wife. I didn't have a clue about how to do anything, how to navigate anything. And I was coming from active duty, right? So I knew if I need to get healthcare, I need to go here. If I need to do this, I go here. But as a spouse, things were completely changed. And there's no handbook when you marry into the military that says, here's how you do things. And when you're coming from the military and becoming a military spouse, if you can't figure it out, I imagine it has to be incredibly challenging for somebody who has no background or military experience leading into that. Some of the things that opened my eyes with your books is the stories are complex. As you mentioned, there's the official policy, there's the unwritten policy, and then there's the workarounds. There's how to get things done. There are also unspoken expectations. And I think some of those were the biggest ones that opened my eyes, especially as as a spouse of a military member, as your military spouse increases in rank, the expectations on you as a military spouse are often greater. Can you talk a little bit about the expectations on military spouses? Kind of do a story arc, from
Yeah.
when you enter to as your spouse gets higher up the chain. What does that look like, and what are some of the ways to handle that?
Yeah. So going back to something you said a moment ago, that there isn't a book. There are books. There are so many books, but they're pink camouflage. So you might not have been gifted the pink camo.
No, I was not.
There,
No.
some of them actually go back to the 1940s, and they used to be called the Navy wife or the Army wife, the Air Force wife. It sounds like those things are artifacts. They're moments in time of what was in the past, but these actually are updated. And the one that I have a copy of, the Air Force spouse now, which is what it's called, and it was updated as recently as 2019. And in these books, it really does outline what is expected of senior officer spouses, but also senior enlisted spouses. But we know that there are expectations, written expectations, unwritten expectations. Spouses are expected to kind of show up for the community. They are essential to building morale. And this is true of enlisted family members and officer families. As you become more senior in the community, the expectations do shift. And someone might be kind of feeling like not just that they want to help their peers, right? It's not just, the person next to you just had a new baby and you want to provide a meal and show support because their service member is deployed. It becomes you contributing to your household. So many spouses will say things like, my spouse, who is a senior leader, is just overwhelmed with their actual duties, but they actually need to step up and do this for the command so that they have this boost in morale. Well, as a spouse, you see it as you helping your partner, not you helping the military. But when you zoom out and you see how prevalent that expectation is, it has become a reliance that people do step up. And in doing a lot of research for this book, I asked spouses who stepped away from those obligations what happened. And often they said someone under them stood up and took over. So it's not that these spouses are volunteering exclusively because they want to. There is an unmet need that these spouses are filling. And it's something that I wanted to address in the book.
Another one of the things that you wrote in your book is kind of about the history of these expectations and how the fit reps or the performance reports, depending on branch of service, how those actually looked at how the spouse supported the unit. Can you address that a little bit? And like, how recently was this part of the senior military officer or enlisted members' fit reps?
I've been alive when it changed. So it was 1988
Okay. Yeah.
is when some Air Force spouses actually went to court because their partners did not get a good fitness report because they were working. So it felt as though they were being prohibited from being able to work. And so 1988 is the year that the Air Force published the findings of a blue ribbon panel. So these things happened before that date, but that's when the findings came out and it became the policy to not hold spouse participation against a service member in their fit reps. However, the need was not addressed. So the things that they had been expected to do were still expected. They just couldn't require it. And they also did not necessarily uniformly provide service members to fill those gaps. There are different service branches that have offered support as recently as 2025. The Marine Corps funded positions for support that would help coordinate with families, but that the position has been removed and now it's a collateral duty for a Marine.
As we know, there are also there's the written expectation and there's the unwritten expectation. So even though that may have fallen off the fit rep at that time, there is still the unwritten, well, how can we address this without having technically written on the report in that manner? So that is very interesting. It's also, you mentioned some of these books go back to the 1940s, and military life and American life back in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, et cetera, it has changed through the years, but now we've reached a time where economically most households in America need to be a two-income household to maintain a certain standard of living that many people are trying to achieve. You'll even find with many officer households, officers obviously make more than enlisted, that many officer households like to have two incomes just to make ends meet or to achieve their financial goals. So some of these expectations don't take into account the changing economic needs of many Americans. Let's talk a little bit about how this impacts military spouses, because many military spouses want to work or need to work, but let's talk about some of the systemic issues that military spouses face with employment. You can take this in any direction because you've got SOFA agreements, you've got frequent PCS moves, you've got certifications and licenses, and however you want to take this, let's just attack it and take a look at it.
Yeah. So there's so many layers to employment, right? So it's a wicked problem. The problem that there really isn't a win-win solution. There's always something that it's not going to ever be perfect. And I think we have to start with that. Just the inherent nature of a highly mobile military. When you move, you have to restart. and civilians, they get to choose. So if they're moving, certainly one partner might not have a job in the new location, but they're making a financial decision based on what is the availability of work for that person. Spouses are told, okay, you're going to go to this location and we're going to start from scratch, right? So we know the problems. We know that the PCS is a huge issue for spouses in being able to retain and move up in their careers. I think some of the things that I have looked at and that I think are less discussed are this notion of choice. And it kind of relates back to it's the spouse's choice to volunteer. It's their choice to be out of the workforce. It's a choice that they make. However, when we look at choices, we have to look at the conditions of those choices. So, yes, as you said, spouses in many cases don't have a choice. They financially must have jobs. And I say jobs because they're not always afforded the luxury of a career. And so spouses report underemployment at ridiculously high numbers. So even if they do have jobs and they're not in that unemployed number, they report not making as much as their peers or not working inside of their area of expertise. Something I recently discovered is that getting an education or adding to your education doesn't necessarily make the problem better for you. Actually, in fact, data from IVMF, which is an institution that does a lot of research in military spousal employment, found the opposite, actually, in that it became the risk of underemployment goes up as you increase your career credentials and things of that nature. So the problem is a wicked problem. There's a lot of perception. And one of those things is the workforce participation. This is my most recent frustration, is that we think of it as a choice, meaning that a spouse who is out of the workforce, they're not considered unemployed. They're out of the workforce. And the way we talk about unemployment, we typically think of a number that looks around 20%. But that number is a percentage of those who are in the workforce. And the reason we do that is because, I'm going to get real nerdy, but the Bureau of Labor Statistics measures unemployment in that way. We look at it because there are a lot of people in America who are retired or they're students. And so that group of people isn't counted in the unemployment number. So when we look at the military spouse population, who are largely of not retirement age, right? Average age is in their 30s. We are a prime working age. When we talk about unemployment, it's closer to the 13% of the total population. But when we look at out of the workforce, 30% of military spouses who are of working age are out of the workforce because they have, and I say quote unquote with air quotes, chosen to leave the workforce. But what were the conditions that they were facing that forced them, I say, not to be looking for work?
That's a great way to look at things. And yes, when you hear unemployment rates are 4% or 5% nationwide, you're right. It doesn't include the students or retirees or those who have self-selected and said, you know what, I'm not going to look for work anymore. So it makes the numbers look good on paper, but it doesn't actually tell the whole story. And that's what your book is doing, is telling the story behind the story. And that's why I found it to be so eye-opening. As somebody who's not in it on a day-to-day basis, my wife and I were in the Guard, so we're in the military, but Guard is a very different beast than active duty in many ways. So what we see is very different than those who are still on active duty and who are doing the PCSs, and they have certain expectations that are put on them. To be fair, the Guard has expectations as well for certain people and things like that, but that's a whole different story. So all of this is good at highlighting the problem. What are some of the things that are being done to address these issues? And what can we as listeners do? Awareness is good, but is there any action that we can take, or what can we do to be part of the solution?
So when it comes to spousal employment, some of the strategies in the past have been to equip the spouses with tools like education or resources or programs, and then to educate employers. However, that's kind of like a game of whack-a-mole, because you get one employer who knows the value of hiring a spouse and then they leave, and then you have to re-educate someone else. And so strategies, I believe, need to be more inclusive of the people who maybe on paper aren't actively searching. I think if we are wanting to get more spouses working, we need to look at who we're targeting our resources to. So are we thinking about those spouses who are 30% out of the workforce, or are we narrowly targeting the 10 to 14% who are actively searching. I think we do both. It's not a one or the other. Unfortunately, wicked problems require comprehensive solutions. But what the average person can do typically is just not dismiss a spouse, really. Once spouses are given opportunities, many people report saying that they are told they're rock stars, right? Because they finally get the opportunity to prove themselves. And then they work really hard to earn that position and might even go above and beyond what someone else will do. And the reality is, there's no guarantee that anyone, military or otherwise, are going to stay in a position. So giving a military spouse a chance, you actually might wind up having them longer than a civilian or a non-military connected person.
Yeah, and that's a great point. And then some of these jobs as well, you might hire somebody locally, and if they PCS, they might be able to still contribute remotely. There are many ways to do that. Not every job, of course, but that's certainly an opportunity. One of the other things I've noticed is that many states are getting on board with accepting licenses and certifications from other states, which I think is huge for the military community, spouses especially, because many of them, you PCS, you get to a new location. If you're a teacher, now you have to go through their entire onboarding process. Now, instead of being a teacher, you can only be a substitute teacher because you don't have the license in that state, or many medical fields and certain other fields that require certain professional licenses and certifications. So seeing those changes, and a lot of that, there's kind of a growth of that happening nationwide. That is a huge change. Do you have any comments on that, or other opportunities you see that might be similar in nature?
So actually, this is a very timely topic because very recently, Georgia was taken to court because they were not honoring the law in actually letting spouses transfer their licenses. So just the presence of these policies does not necessarily mean that it equates to the outcomes that we're looking for. And it takes a lot of enforcement, which the Department of Justice is stepping up behind military spouses to support them in these issues. So I think that there are ways, policies are the first step, but enforcing the policies is another component that, the existence of a policy does not equate to a solution, right? It's how effective is it, and are we revisiting those issues? Another thing that comes to mind is privatized military housing. There was a lot of mold in housing. Families took these companies to court, and it raised awareness. We created the Military Tenant Bill of Rights to help give families the tools they needed to push back against privatized housing if needed. But we need to revisit that, right? So just because that exists doesn't mean it's working. So we need to kind of establish new policies, but we also need to come back and touch base and see how things are going.
Yeah, that is a great point. I wasn't aware of this issue in Georgia. And you're right. What sounds good on paper isn't always as good in practice. And I'm sure if you've been in the military for more than a minute, you've seen a little bit of that throughout your career. So let's take a little step back. You spoke to many different spouses. Obviously, you have your personal experience that you can draw from, and those of your friends and your close associates. Are there any stories that you'd like to share from the book that are kind of personal in nature, but that illustrate some of the issues some of the military spouse community members are facing?
So there's so many. So it's always hard to choose. But if I were to pick one that I think people should know about, is the story of my friend Theresa Jones. Her husband, Landon Jones, was killed while serving. He was a helicopter pilot, and his helicopter was chained down to the deck of the ship, and it went into the ocean, and he died. She found out about this via Facebook, and it was obviously very traumatic. It's the worst case scenario for military family members. We worry about our service members no matter what. And so obviously her story is important. But the reason that I connected with her, our husbands were in similar communities. So it was one of those connections where, the person who came before you talked about that person, right? Everyone knows someone like that. And so their family was that person, the one who came before us. We hear the stories about how fun they were. And then when I was asked to write a story about something called the widow's tax, which it's the SBPDIC offset, which is the official title of what was called the widow's tax, which essentially, to keep it simple, was a issue of concurrent receipt where the military, the government won't pay for the same thing twice in benefits. However, one of those things, to put it simply, was a payment that the service member would pay into, And so there's an assumption that you will receive something back when you pay in. But that money wasn't being distributed to many survivors. And so in talking with Theresa, I just learned how we rely upon our surviving family members to advocate for themselves. Those men and women, children of those who lost their lives, would go to Capitol Hill, tell their stories of loss time and time again, and they did it for 40 years before they saw change. And that to me is an unacceptable scenario when we make a promise to those who serve that we'll care for their families. So that's why I always choose her story, because it touches me every time I tell it, because we owe so much more to those families.
Yeah, 100%. I remember reading about this through the years, and it's tough when you're asking those to advocate for themselves when they are the ones who are struggling. And it feels as though they don't have a voice because they're moved out of the military. You're just kind of on the outside. And look at me, I have a story to tell. And I'm not saying that to minimize it, but I'm saying it as though like how you might feel. And it is very tough to ask those people to advocate for themselves when they're struggling and just really trying to get by, and they're already dealing with the loss of their spouse and their service member. And gosh, that is such a terrible thing. And it's good that there are other voices who can amplify that and can help bring light to their story. Let's talk a little bit now about some of the changes we've seen that are a positive light. And as we're looking at this going forward, what is a call to action that you would want people to have after reading your book?
Well, every chapter kind of does have a call to action, and it has a call to action for the department, the Pentagon, and it has calls to action for readers, civilians, or spouses. So each one kind of is different. In the chapter that features Theresa's story, there is an immediate call to action. At the time of our recording, there is policy that's being proposed that would allow surviving family members to remarry without losing their benefits. Right now, they're not allowed to remarry before the age of 55 without losing those benefits. But if you recall earlier in our conversation, when we were talking about unemployment, well, those spouses have sacrificed their career over the years, and they suddenly find themselves sole breadwinners. They don't pay into retirement. They are rarely fully vested in their retirement because they move every few years. So spouses start at a disadvantage. And so approving this policy would go a long way in taking care of them. So that's one call to action. Others would just be listening to spouse stories, reading their stories, hearing from them, and not treating them as tangential. I think we hear this for the National Guard, the reserves. People don't understand the lifestyle or the experience, so they kind of brush over the struggles. And so you can think of it at any level within the military community. How close are you to the operational necessity? And that's, where priority goes. And perception-wise, the further away you are from that, the less you are prioritized.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to phrase that, right? And I guess that's what I was trying to say for those spouses who have lost their military member and now they're kind of on the outside looking and they're no longer the priority. And that's how the military has always run. Who is our priority right now? Everybody else is just kind of on the side. And I think all of us who have served have kind of felt that to one degree or another, but I can't imagine what it's like to lose a spouse and then have to deal with all the red tape and not really have the means to fight it from the inside. So I love that you're highlighting that story and working with them. I know you've written multiple articles through your freelance journalism career, and I've read some of those on different platforms as well. So getting that word out there is huge. Getting it in front of the congressional leaders who really write those rules I guess that's really important. And it just takes a lot of advocacy. It takes a lot of voices unifying and really highlighting and saying, no, this is important. And I love that you're doing that through your work, through your book, and through your journalism and research. Is there anything else you'd like to share about your book or anything else you'd like to share with the community?
Just because you're not necessarily hearing from family members in a loud way doesn't mean that they are not impacted by what you see on the news or the articles that you read about the service member's point of view. In the book, one thing I did was I looked at who was represented in the media, and so whose stories are getting out there. And one of the two findings that I would like to share that I think speak to why I wrote the book, but also speak to the need for us to kind of re-examine how we look at the community is Military family stories, I did a little sampling of who was represented, and only 6 out of roughly 150 stories even remotely featured things to do with families. And when I looked through who was being quoted, officers were quoted 9-1 above enlisted personnel. And that does not reflect the makeup of the military. And so we know that the voices that are the loudest in the community are not necessarily representative. So I would just encourage listeners to read stories of those they don't quite understand their experiences of, whether it's this book or another. Talk to family members and ask them their experience. They're not often asked, about their experience. So I think that goes a long way in recognizing not only their sacrifices, which they do make sacrifices, but just makes a connection with that person. It's, the more we can talk to each other, the better off our understanding, and we can find some shared purpose.
Well, I agree with you 100%. I think connection through story is one of the most powerful ways that we can connect. And when we can share things on a personal level, we then feel a deeper connection and kind of partnership with other people. And it's easier to see just beyond labels. So thank you so much, Jennifer, for sharing your story, for sharing the stories of so many other military members through your book, and more importantly, highlighting their stories and some of the struggles and issues that they faced, and highlighting ways to make those easier or find solutions. Those calls to action that you have at every chapter are very important. I especially love how you have the call to action for the military, because a lot of times senior leadership, they don't see all of those things. So seeing those in a nice written format hopefully will bring some more attention to these issues. Is there anything else you'd like to add for the community, or is there anywhere you'd like people to be able to find you, such as a website, or where can they find your book?
The book is on Bookshop, which is where you can find your local bookstore through that. It's on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, pretty much most places. If you want to connect with me, I'm on LinkedIn, and obviously working with the Military Wallet as well. So see some articles there every once in a while.
Awesome. Well, Jennifer, thanks for joining us. For listeners, if you want to check out her book, it's called The Military Stories You've Been Told and the Ones You Need to Hear. I highly recommend it. It will definitely open your eyes. So, Jennifer, thanks again for joining us.
Thanks for having me.